Now, I want to begin this sort of plague chronicle from 1900 Sydney. First person to fall ill. But with the second case, that of a sailor maker who was called Captain Dudley, and who died on February 23rd, 1900. And in particular, I want to focus on the actions of his wife, Mrs. Dudley. Now, it might be unfair to sort of impute ulterior motives to his wife, Mrs. Dudley, or doubt her clinical judgment. According to the parliamentarian William Hughes, she made an excellent case for why her husband did not have a genuine case of the plague when he was diagnosed in February 1900. She thought, and Hughes did not disagree, that he instead had misdiagnosed peritonitis. Mrs. Dudley's defences may have been prompted by shame at the enormous crowd of police which surrounded her home in Drummoyne after her husband's death. When it was discussed in Parliament, various members noted that her house was blocked off by crowds and that their yacht was quarantined. That's real hardship if you're a Sydney-sider, I'm sure we can all relate. Perhaps to avoid being labelled irresponsible and to ward off this shame, Mrs. Dudley readily publicised that she had done her best to reduce risk and keep a clean household. 3 weeks before her husband fell ill and died, Hughes reported, she is said to have written to the municipal council to ask for a heap of rubbish to be removed from a blind alley near her house. William Hughes clarified, I don't mean a heap as big as a cathedral, but I mean a heap so big that those of us who are here might have easily been buried underneath it. For Hughes, the odours reeking from this heap of composting refuse were a congenial nest, a hotbed, a ferment, with the germs of plague flying around. We have someone who can't hear well, so I'm wondering if I should use the... Okay, is that better? Okay, great. Arguments between various levels of government resulted, with the New South Wales government taking Mrs. Dudley's side to blame the local council. In reports that were challenged in Parliament as exaggerated, tons of rubbish were reportedly removed from the laneway weeks after Dudley's death by the government's specially appointed plague quarantine and cleaning crew, headed by an architect called George Macready. By March, the City of Sydney had been directed by the Secretary of the Board of Health to serve a notice on the landlord, one Honourable John C., to reconstruct the sewerage connection. Other parliamentarians implicated the condition of Dudley's workplace in his eventual susceptibility to disease and lambasted the government and Board of Health for sending so many police officers to his household while quarantining only one level of his workplace in Darling Harbour. Another parliamentarian, Reid, insisted that the Board of Health should have evicted every business from the building and had everything taken out and burnt. Indeed, the entire district around Sussex Street, where Dudley worked and lived some of the time, was actually quarantined, or, as we're more familiar with, locked down following his death, while the plague proceeded to zigzag across Sussex Street to 3 or 4 places before jumping streets to spread further into the city and along the harbour-side wharves. And yes, it did eventually reach Pyrmont. Nearby residents scrambled to disassociate themselves from the disease. Being quarantined or locked down for intervention was embarrassing, inconvenient, and could result in property and entire homes being destroyed by cleaning crews. Individuals, families, houses, shops and suburbs all made valiant efforts to avoid association with plague. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that a Mr. Dorrell lived only 50 yards or so from Mr. Dudley, but after Mr. Dorrell objected, the paper had to revise its statement to say that he lived a full 200 yards away. In his speech to Parliament, William Hughes recalled the reaction of the public to Dudley's death and subsequent quarantine of parts of the city. The Board of Health building had been almost demolished piecemeal, and when I went there the next day, it was a ruin. Thousands of people had attempted to get in by main force. Men and women had fainted. People had climbed in through the windows. The whole place was simply on the eve of a great panic. And in fact, in my opinion, the panic had set in.
At this point, the Premier William Lyon interjected to point out that the public had broken the staircase of the Board of Health building. For Hughes, by June, the population of Sydney had still not recovered from this catalytic moment after Dudley died. There are many people who are generally residents of the city and suburbs who have not yet mustered up the courage to come back. After Dudley died, Sydneysiders made a considerable effort to put a distance between themselves and their city. Sydney was completely deserted. The upper classes avoided it completely. Theatres, hotels and places of congregation were empty. Shops and businesses were shunned. As parliamentarian Billy Hughes recalled in June, in the initial stages of the pandemic, people were being frightened out of their seven senses. For Hughes, even by June, the population of Sydney had not recovered from this moment. An advertisement for the mutual stores on Pitt Street stated, "Owing to the scare caused by the plague, numbers of families have been kept away from the city, and visitors from the country and adjoining colonies have been conspicuous in their absence. The consequence to trade is that there is a surplusage of our stocks of winter articles, especially of high-class qualities." Notwithstanding Ashburton Thompson's efforts to assure the public that the plague was not contagious, the public responded to the plague with considerable fear and aversion, which compelled them to distance themselves from the location of the supposed threat. In Sydney, the constant threat of disease made the population diffident in their dealings with each other, while the plague epidemic generated outright hostility. People could not confidently interact with one another without fearing that someone or other might harbour the inconspicuous germs that would cause them harm. Rather than venture to the city, people found new ways to do business, placing orders through postcards, letters, telegrams and telephones. So we were not the first people to invent online shopping. In March, the Evening News visited the wholesale district of the city to gauge the public feeling, the vibe, regarding the progress of the plague, reporting, "When a Sussex Street merchant meets a customer in other parts of the cities, discusses business and winds up with a trite saying, 'Would you call at my office?' a frequent answer is, 'I'd rather telephone.' Distance was imperative." The 7th Australian Prime Minister, so William Hughes, who was a member of the New South Wales Parliament in 1900, claimed that if one is to understand what a city of the dead would actually be like, I can only state that it would be the busiest thoroughfare in Sydney, as I knew it for 6 weeks. He went on, "We must remember that there was a panic, that every man or nearly every man that could afford it left Sydney, that thousands of visitors who were coming here avoided Sydney as if it were leprous." The bulletin stated, "There is much panic, a mad rush to the Blue Mountains," while the Sydney Morning Herald commented, "The truism that it is an ill wind that blows nobody good has been exemplified in a marked degree by the benefit according the western suburbs through the exodus of the population westward from the city." So that whole, COVID-19 sort of tree change, sea change trend also was replicated to some degree at this time. Now, while it is not often the focus of pandemic histories, I want to emphasise in this talk that emotions matter in these events. And the way that emotions are enlisted, galvanised and produced in language and in writing will provoke an emotional response that is really genuinely felt and internalised by people. These emotions can be mobilised to create a really urgent response precisely because they're felt so quickly and readily. So between the 19th of January and the 9th of August 1900, 303 people in Sydney contracted the bubonic plague. 103 died. The 1900 outbreak was the first in a series of 10 outbreaks in Sydney over 21 years, which formed part of the third global pandemic of plague. Now, these numbers are not sky high. The discourses around the plague spread far quicker than the plague itself. Newspaper articles were written, letters to the editors were tabled, speeches were made in Parliament, medical reports were written, medical journal articles were written, and there were a number of citizens' vigilance committees and other forms of committees that grew up to try to repress the threat. So the reason why I think we should focus on how emotion was provoked in this event is to understand not only the powerful force in historical processes, but the role that they played in justifying and naturalising decision-making and the response in disease outbreaks or medical events, particularly where the science itself is uncertain. And I will go to that. It is very important that we understand the way emotions work in pandemics or in any event where an urgent response is required, including the role they've played and continue to play to support authoritative discourses and institutions to do their work. Sydney makes a good case study for studying the powerful role of emotions because it was a relatively new and rapidly changing city when the plague hit, transforming rapidly due to demographic change and readily influenced by the emergence and growing importance of both the science of bacteriology and the institutionalisation of public health. And I'll just give you a little bit of background to what was sort of going on in Sydney at that time. Gold was sort of discovered around the 1850s, and after that there was a big population boom in southeastern Australia in general. The number of people living in Sydney multiplied almost 12 times its size in less than 50 years. So in 1830, there were 12,000 people in Sydney, and by 1901, there was almost 500,000. So that is a huge jump to have gone through in a very short space of time. The new suburbs were mostly tucked along the varied peninsulas of Sydney. So if you think around the north, up to Manly, around sort of Watson's Bay and Coogee, these sorts of things. And a lot of these suburbs were connected to transport and to sewerage. There was a bit of an inequality between the centre and periphery at that time, with urban poor and immigrants mostly living in the city in rental properties that were not connected to sewerage, surrounded by certain types of industrial and business activity, which were often referred to at the time as noxious trades. There was a bit of a disparity then between the city and the suburbs. At the same time, there was a growth in bacteriology. Established in 1896, the New South Wales Board of Health was led by Chief Medical Officer J. Ashburton-Thompson. Ashburton-Thompson was a perceptive leader who achieved a measure of global fame for progressive response to the plague pandemic. He was an expert data collector, and his reports were useful across the world for researchers trying to establish the complex ecology of the bubonic plague. Ashburton-Thompson had appointed Frank Tidswell to be the bacteriologist for the Department of Health. He'd read all the reports published about the discovery of plague bacteria and understood that disease in rats usually preceded and was somehow implicated in the infection of people. In 1900, he just didn't know exactly how the complex ecology came together in chains of infection. And this might have been one reason why he struggled to convince the New South Wales government to adopt all his recommendations in this first outbreak. In the next 9 outbreaks of plague, the government just let the Board of Health handle things. But in this first outbreak, it was distinctive for a long and important conflict between the Board of Health and the government about what to do. In particular, there was a conflict about whether the plague was a contagious disease and whether or not it was necessary to quarantine contacts of people who had been infected. So I think if we remember back to COVID, obviously if you had to go into quarantine, sometimes you actually had COVID and sometimes you'd just been near someone with COVID and you still had to go into that 2 weeks of quarantine, even if you'd just been at a venue where COVID was present. And that's because COVID is, in fact, a contagious viral disease. But the plague at that time, the plague that was present in Sydney at that time, bubonic plague, is not a contagious disease per se, it is spread by the flea. So flea bites a rat that's infected and then it bites a person. And so it isn't necessary to quarantine a person who's just been near someone who's been infected. Although you do want to carefully examine the environment to see if there are any rats or fleas around, of course. So in accordance with popular feeling at that time, as Ashburton-Thompson put it, that contacts could be a threat, the New South Wales Premier, William Lyne, overruled the Board of Health, deciding to remove all people who had had contact with the sick to a purpose-built North End quarantine station. A powerful emotional response to plague filled the vacuum created by this conflict and uncertainty, influencing decisions by government, local authorities, the public, and individuals. And that is more or less what my book is about. Sorry, excuse me. Now, as I've said, the city, of Sydney was more or less deserted after Captain Dudley died as a result of his infection with plague. And everyone was noticing it, the business people, people in government, local council, state government. So something had to be done to build or rebuild people's confidence in the city. They didn't want this situation to go on. The New South Wales government was thus compelled to sort of increase its administrative reach and efficiency, and what I call pacify public space, which means to say to clean up the public spaces of Sydney. And they did this using public health. Public health was the key instrument to make the public spaces of Sydney safe. The New South Wales Board of Health was established in 1875, and in 1896 its powers were extended with the government's first Public Health Act. This readiness to respond was reflected in the board's involvement in each of the three main forms of institutional effort to contain and eradicate the plague. And they were rat extermination, quarantine, and a massive cleaning up and sanitation project. As Sydney-siders gradually returned to the city, forced to interact with and transact with one another once again, their total avoidance and desertion started to give way to forms of what I'd call aversion of other people. In April, an ad appeared in the Sunday Times under the title Bubonic Plague, urging people to avoid crowded buses and trams with their attendant microbes by riding a Redbird cycle. Their competitors at Bennett and Wood cycle platers exhorted people instead to ride a speedwell and be saved from the plague. Newspapers and the railway commissioners received complaints about whether sick people should be allowed to travel on public transport. One person apparently suffering illness was placed in the second-class carriage of the Southern train at Redfern, complained a letter to the editor of the Cumberland Argus. The author objected. The sufferer's cough was pitiable and his expectorations disgusting, but the passengers had to put up with both. So people were very stressed out about coming together in the city at that time. So I call this in the book a kind of a strategy, and it's a strategy of labelling something as dirty or disgusting. This strategy is effective because it creates a kind of physiological response. These accusations that something is dirty or disgusting kind of start to create a bit of a feedback loop, whereby when you see something that has been previously labelled as disgusting, you naturally respond to it with disgust. And disgust is very engulfing in the moment due to the way that it animates the body. Now, disgust is a very interesting emotion. It's intense, often involuntary, and quite urgent. Sometimes we might recoil or run away. Something is too intimate or too close to us. We do not want our body to be in proximity with what offends it. And this is very different to fear. Fear will make you avoid something. But disgust, it kind of just makes you want to distance yourself and then get rid of that thing. Philosopher Winifred Meddinghouse characterises disgust as a spontaneous and especially energetic act of refusal that is experienced as a need to refuse the nearness or presence of another. Disgust alarms the body, pulls it away, urgently tries to put distance between it and its object. Now, there's also a bit of a fascination with disgusting things, and I think that that is one of the explanations for why there was so much media interest in the plague at that time. But the main provocation of disgust would sort of result in both distance from the object or identity or thing that's supposed to cause a threat, and also a desire to get rid of it or clean it up. So these newspaper reports or speeches that were mobilising emotions like disgust were usually doing that in order to try to compel this program of cleaning or, certain types of interventions in civic space. It was quite a politicised, strategic use of language. Some newspapers, such as Sydney newspaper at that time, The Truth, made this connection very explicit. The vegetable den of a Chinaman, the pickle factory of a Syrian, the fruit shop of an Italian, the fish shop of a Greek, and the crimping den of a German housekeeper on the waterfront. These are the weak points in Sydney's sanitary system. I know. But with proper municipal and government regulation, these frowsy foreigners would not be allowed to convert parts of the city into plague spots, to keep cellars full of the offal of fish and poultry, or of decaying vegetables and fruit, or to wallow in personal customs of unmentionable filthiness. So that's a pretty blatant example, and let me tell you, there are quite a lot of them, and they appear in government speeches, they appear in letters to the City of Sydney Council, they appear in responses from the City of Sydney Council to these letters of complaint, and they're very obviously quite politicised ways of trying to associate people, identities, and different types of things with dirt and with dirtiness to get someone to do something, and usually it's to try and remove people or get rid of people or get rid of certain types of businesses and this kind of thing. And my point is here, disgust is provoked by dirt. So it stands to reason that we associate a person or place with dirt if we want others to respond to it with disgust or put distance between themselves and that object. But, as I've been saying, we do more to dirt than just respond to it with disgust. What else do we do to dirt? We clean it. We go hard. We clean that stuff up. The anthropologist Mary Douglas argues that we will forfeit confidence in an order that cannot symbolise and respond to ambiguity. Once something is classified as a pollutant, we will respond to it through cleansing and purifying rituals, and it is imperative that we do so. Calling something dirt demands sublimation or intervention. So while reacting to something or someone with disgust is a way to put distance between oneself and that object, describing that object in terms of dirt will give you a platform to change it. On the 23rd of April, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that a Chinese man who was sick with the plague had been wrongly attributed to botany, in spite of the fact that so far there has not been a single case within the boundaries of the municipality. In response, the council arranged for the mayor to inspect every house occupied by Chinese people. His inspection report apparently found their homes to be internally clean and featuring nothing that might be detrimental to the health of their occupants in consequence of their natural habits. However, the report concluded that each of their homes lacked proper drainage and might therefore menace the health of people living in surrounding districts. To allay panic, Botany Council resolved to condemn the buildings. So yeah, absolutely nothing wrong with them, but these homes were demolished. The Chinese and their sort of supposedly irredeemable premises were scapegoated as a source of contagion so that their neighbours could live without intervention. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, people began to move into the suburbs, and as they moved into the suburbs, they started to form a new sensitivity to the odours they experienced on their trips to the city. I don't think I would disagree with the generalised reports that in 1900 Sydney stank. A report to the Local Government Board of Great Britain about the diffusion of the plague throughout the world had this to say. This is good. Sydney, of all the Australian towns, was the dirtiest. Mm-hmm. The streets in the lower part of town were said to be seldom clear of refuse of hide and wool scourings, which, under the conditions of the humid atmosphere, gave off emanations of a most unsavoury sort. Not a fan. The New South Wales Minister for Works, Mr O'Sullivan, proposed that barrels of pitch and tar be burnt in the streets to purify the atmosphere. He was mocked. The amazingly up-to-date New South Wales Minister O'Sullivan wants to go back to the devices of the Great Plague of London and burn barrels of tar in the streets, mocked an author in the bulletin. Even the Board of Health rebuked the government for a lack of focus on rat extermination. But while Mr. O'Sullivan's idea for transforming the atmosphere was mocked, the Board of Health was heavily involved in the omnipresence of fumigation, which was used as a method of flushing out city spaces and of replacing the odours. At lending libraries across the city, books and magazines were fumigated with something called formalin, which had a recognisable but apparently not disagreeable odour. Due to anxiety about plague spreading from the city to the regions, the Council of the Railway Institute ensured that the library was disinfected weekly and all incoming books were fumigated by the latest method. These strict measures of fumigation and disinfection were taken, notwithstanding a general recognition that there has not been a single case of infectious disease in Sydney traceable to library books. So nothing whatsoever. And there you go, you've got... I believe that this is the Mechanics School of the Arts. So up on Pitt Street. By March 16, a dedicated team was assembled under the Superintendent of Fumigation to undertake mandatory fumigation for all ships arriving in Australia or travelling from Sydney to other ports in Australia, for which they needed a fumigation certificate. Notwithstanding the futility of the method, on April 3rd, the Board of Water Supply and Sewerage began fumigating the sewers to try to asphyxiate rats. Sulphur and chloride of lime were flushed through the sewer network in such vast quantities that Darling Harbour filled up with dead fish. Talk about disgusting. While this method killed very few rats, sulphur leaks did help McCready's team identify weak points in the sewage network. So there might have been a few watery eyes, but it was all for the greater good. So this is, the kinds of chemicals that you could buy at that time. Quite popular. There. So, this is a good one. Here we go. Wait for it. So, I think you're getting the links. So personal odours changed as well. Smoking became quite popular as it was considered to create a personal atmosphere of immunity to disease. Sales of tobacco went up and its popularity even prompted the Collector of Customs to permit smoking inside various parts of Customs House at Circular Quay. So during a disease outbreak, as we probably saw ourselves during COVID, the way that we sort of judge certain things as disgusting might change. At one point in the pandemic, I recall sort of seeing a group of people wandering around without masks caused a little bit of consternation. And if, you went into a room that didn't feel very well ventilated and there were groups of people unmasked, that could actually result in actual disgust or agitation if they were too close. Later or maybe before the pandemic, that same group would only have caused that reaction maybe if they were smoking and the smoke bothered you. Though perhaps if you judged that smoke was beneficial or curative, you might even take comfort in it. And what I'm trying to explain here is that ideas were changing very quickly and urgently, and changing how we respond to the world around us. This isn't always a straightforward process, because sometimes these reactions are happening quite urgently or spontaneously. We genuinely feel disgusted by the smell of cigarette smoke or the sight of people talking on a train without a mask. And we're not thinking usually at that moment, there's a public health order a few weeks ago and that's why I'm disgusted by these things. Our cultural judgments are sort of happening all the time, but they're disconnected in the moment in time from the emotional responses they inform. So you might learn something one day, and then a week later, that might inform your emotional response. The reactions become somewhat automatic or habitual, as the psychologists Easton and Diamond have argued, but they will change, or they can change again, in line with cultural judgments and knowledge. So, for example, back in 1900, there were these odours which might have been very pungent to some people, but did not provoke disgust because their pungency was judged during that outbreak to have some kind of protective nature. Formalin, carbolic acid, tobacco. Like, it's very unlikely if you walked into a room today with that combination of smells, we'd think, awesome, we're very safe here. Meanwhile, smoke, and other products as well were very popular at that time, things like the Caltha compound and the Elliott Brothers chemist smelling salts, which were thought to protect against Prague bacilli. They were in demand. Workers near the infected harbour took extra precautions like tucking their drawers into boots and carrying camphor, and that caused a surge in the price of camphor. On the remarkable sale of onions, the Evening News noted a generalised panic buying. However, customers rejected the Victorian brown Spanish bulb, which was supposed to be too mild as a preventative against the plague. This sort of belief that onions might purify the air and absorb germs wasn't massively widespread, but it was present, with sliced onions placed beside sick people's beds, on sick people's bedside to capture disease. Acrid or pungent smells, typically disgusting, were reinterpreted as protective, reinforcing how disgust shifts with scientific and cultural perceptions. On the 6th of May 1900, during that first outbreak, a concerned citizen wrote a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald. He claimed that doctors would have a better chance of pulling a patient through an attack if the great dread was removed and the patient's spirits kept up. Fear and avoidance had too great an impact on the city, and he said, many ladies are positively afraid to go to town, and in some case I know of, hardly care to go outside their own door for fear of knocking against someone who had the plague and thus contracting it. Now, I haven't gone into this in detail, but do feel free to ask me about this in questions. 1900 was a very, very formative time in Sydney's history. It was the end of a century and the final year before all the self-governing colonies were federated in the Commonwealth of Australia. For the first time, the New South Wales Board of Health exercised its new powers under the Public Health Act to force quarantine, sanitation and hygiene to ward off the threat of disease and the public crisis that it provoked. In turn, the successful response of the Board of Health in its analysis of epidemiology and cause of plague established its authority within New South Wales and Australia more broadly. So I'm going to reinforce that point. The Board of Health did a pretty good job. Not that many cases, 101 deaths, 303 cases overall. The cleaning operation was massive, and the Board of Health was seen as fairly successful, particularly because Ashburton Thompson used that event to gather the evidence and publish evidence that would later go on to prove the role of fleas in plague transmission. So Australia then got a little bit of extra credit. Public health came to intervene in affairs of the state from the management of borders, immigration and national identity through things like quarantine, the management of regulation of streets, waterfronts, homes and individuals as they circulated through the city. While the medical intelligence leading the public health response was particularly well informed in Sydney, the uncertainty in how disease was spread also provoked a strong emotional response and a demand for intervention. This demand was based more on our reaction to whatever occupied the contingent category of dirt rather than strict knowledge of disease causation. And it is a pattern that we may see in other attempts at containing disease when there is uncertainty. The strategy works. People avoided the city and each other, particularly specific kinds of others. Individuals who contracted plague and anyone they had contact with were hauled off to quarantine for weeks at a time in a windswept quarantine station miles from the city. Their property or clothes could be doused in harsh chemicals, fumigated or burnt. When they died, They were buried 50 feet underground on a cliff top above the Pacific Ocean, with both bodies and the coffin itself wrapped in sheets of sublimate solution. Parts of the city were quarantined, locked down to residents and visitors who could not enter or leave. The atmosphere of the city was filled with odours of disinfectants, masking the city's dirty secrets or anything that might provoke disgust. A reaction of disgust may naturalise and justify various forms of occasionally quite oppressive intervention against specific people and places. And feel free to ask me a bit more about the cleaning campaign, because it was quite interesting how that played out. By focusing on the role of emotions, specifically discussed in this event, I hope that it might provide some basis for re-evaluation, maybe a better awareness of how emotions rise up in an urgent way during periods of uncertainty, and make us feel like some responses are entirely warranted and natural, even if that response, our emotional response, has actually changed and will change again in line with new medical knowledge and changes to the environment and the spaces that we share. And that is it for me for today. So thank you very much, and I hope you have some questions.
Thanks, Philippa. I'm sure they've got lots of questions. One question I'd like to ask is, the dramatic intervention on the foreshores and the almost the nationalisation of the foreshores was a pretty significant outcome and changed Sydney quite dramatically. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there was basically most of the wharves were rebuilt at that time, and the Sydney Harbour foreshore was actually established as a result of the plague event. So people were very concerned with the state of the wharves, with the way that rats were sort of escaping boats docking at the harbour, and the sort of the state of the businesses around that area. And I think that's why I sort of chose that case of Captain Dudley, because his business was obviously located on the harbour. He was a sailor maker, so it was a kind of a potent example of how the real focus on the harbour foreshore at that time. The other thing that is very interesting about the sort of regulation of the seas was that, the fumigation practices that I spoke about continued to be used on ships for some time, and ships were kind of considered a very weird sort of, basically, they didn't want to slow down trade, so they didn't want to have to quarantine boats for too long, and so they would use these fumigation methods to allow ships to come in and out of the harbour quickly, even though the evidence that they were effective was fairly shaky. And I think that that's because there was a real emphasis or focus around that time on, establishing a kind of a national maritime border, and as part of that, there was a massive focus on shutting out certain racial identities. So the Chinese, as we all know about, were affected by the White Australia policy that was introduced the next year after Federation. But the other group of people that was massively affected was, people that were sort of supposed to be diseased. And that could be, there was a very subjective judgment that sort of went into whether or not you were potentially diseased. So there was a kind of a big conflation, I suppose, of certain types of racial identities and certain types of potentially sick people as just, people we want to kind of keep out of Australia. And so this sort of perimeter, the re-establishment of the perimeter was sort of seen as an effective way of fortifying Sydney and fortifying Australia from the sort of outside menace of, other cultures and potentially other diseases as well.
Questions?
I have a few. But the fact that South St. Louis was reporting on the plague in Sydney, how widespread was this plague?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that journal article, there were actually a few reports in things like the Lancet. Obviously, the reason for this was that as I was sort of saying, Ashburton Thompson, our chief medical officer, was considered very progressive in a global sense. So if you compare Australia's or Sydney's response to, say, San Francisco, in San Francisco, it was almost a little bit like sort of COVID, the Trump era kind of COVID, or COVID under Trump, where he was sort of denying that it was happening and, kind of blaming it on outsiders and just sort of really denying that it was going on. And in Australia, Ashburton Thompson was, he was from England, and, a lot of people, sort of in history journals, he's actually been knocked quite a lot as, particularly racist, because he did, in his data, kind of classify Chinese people separately to people, British subjects, that sort of thing. But he was on another, people complex, right? And he was also, in terms of the scientific or the establishment of the science and epidemiology of plague, he was quite progressive. So he used the outbreak in Australia to sort of collect data to try to work out whether or not this theory that had been advanced by Paul Louis Simon, that the flea was the vector of plague. He collected data to try to analyse that theory and to test that theory. So at the time, I think Simon published his theory in like 1896 or something. It was just after the plague bacillus was identified. And Simon was a French epidemiologist, and he was initially absolutely laughed at. He was a laughing stock of the medical community. Everyone said that his idea that it was transmitted by a flea was ridiculous, because people were very committed to this idea that plague spread by miasma or bad air, which is sort of a medieval, that's why you had Mr. O'Sullivan wanting to burn barrels of tar and this sort of thing. It's sort of a medieval idea that plague was spread by bad air, and therefore a lot of people in the medical community were still quite committed to that view, which is why I think it took a while for this vector-based theory to be established. But plague is sort of spread in the same way that malaria or Zika virus, dengue, is spread through an insect vector. So anyway, back to this, what was going on in Sydney. So Ashburton Thompson's report about what happened in Sydney, which is kind of one of the major evidence bases for my book, became quite important internationally, because it sort of, he examined this theory and he took it quite seriously and sort of said, well, I don't have conclusive proof, but on balance,